So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 53rd webinar in the series Rethinking Cities. I'm Rajesh Ramakrishnan. I work with INHAF. Before moving on to today's topic, the city and the right to work, a brief background about this series. Following the nationwide lockdown imposed after the first wave of the pandemic in June 2020 last year, we in INHAF saw an opportunity to organize a webinar series on the theme Rethinking Cities. Our thinking behind this was that one, our cities as they are today and the way they are growing and developing do not look like they are meeting the challenge of an urban population of an estimated 820 million by 2050, while continuing as the engine of economic growth that they are supposed to be. And two, governmental efforts alone are not adequate to ensure healthy, livable, productive, inclusive, and sustainable cities. And three, wider society has the required skills, expertise, and know-how to contribute meaningfully in the search for new approaches and solutions. So it's perhaps the first time ever that such an effort has been organized to take the urban challenge to the people. This webinar series is seen as feeding into a citizens' urban initiative, City URI, by getting to know more individuals, organizations, and institutions through their engagement with the webinars for their skills, expertise, experience, and interest, thereby building a wider support constituency. Also, by using a part of the webinar outputs as startup material for activity for urban transformation, and thereby presenting City URI as a public cause, getting a message across for a wider societal ownership of meeting the urban transformation challenge. In the last 14 months, we have completed around 52 webinars over multiple themes as varied as cities, urbanization and the pandemic, homelessness, informal settlements and housing, informal livelihoods in the city, urban poverty, governance and finance, urban ecology and sustainability, water, sanitation and hygiene, sustainable mobility, gender and cities, youth and cities, heritage conservation, and architecture and planning education. So some 300 urban experts, professionals, specialists, as well as community groups have shared their views and perspectives on these multiple themes and sub-themes. Our partners for the webinars, more than 50 in number, both national and international, have ranged from bilateral and multilateral agencies to academic institutions, NGOs, networks, urban local bodies, government ministries, social enterprises, and finance and microfinance institutions. We have had till now approximately 1.5 lakh views live on Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube. So these webinars will continue to be an integral part of INHAF's work in the coming years, at least 2 a month, to continue our engagement with civil society and build a citizens' urban initiative, City URI. So let me now hand over to Dunu Roy to take up the webinar.
Thank you, Rajesh. I hope I'm audible to everybody. It's actually a delight to have this webinar. It's taken a long time to organize. I've been pursuing these very eminent gentlemen and ladies for a long time to get some ideas onto the table. Very briefly, in many of the seminars that have been organized or are being organized, not just by INHAF, but by many other groups on various issues, the voice of the worker is not heard. Essentially, it is not heard because either they are speaking, the groups who are speaking don't represent the worker, or if they do, by and large, it's a rural workforce which is being represented. The urban workforce is hardly represented, and particularly by unions and associations who have worked with them for a period of years. What we hear from our experts, specialists, academics, institutions who have done research or some kind of activity with workers at different times. So this is the first attempt in my knowledge to get people who have been intimately associated with working class organizations, who have looked at gender issues, who have looked at caste issues, and who have looked at regional issues to come in and dialogue some of these facets. And I'm really very happy to see all of you and welcome you to this webinar. Uh, there are two themes around which I will request you to present your thoughts and your ideas. The first theme is essentially that can workers plan? We know very well that the urban space is actually made by the worker. It's constructed by the worker. Whether it is sewerage, transportation, markets, um, retail, employment, factories, offices, whatever, residences, they are all spaces which the workers create, they construct it in many informal ways. But the key question is, can workers formally participate in the planning process itself? And if they can, then how do we go about it? Where do you see the openings, the opportunities for them to contribute to actually design a city from a worker's perspective? So that's the first theme. And the second theme is particularly during and after the lockdown, the issue of work has taken on a very important dimension. We are all familiar with the pictures of the workers who walked back home, but we are not so familiar with pictures of the workers who stayed and their stories, what happened to them. And in that part, the there have been now at least 5 initiatives that I know of that are talking about ensuring a certain degree of security for work in the workplace, in different workplaces, formal or informal, and most of them are patterned on the existing Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme and Act. Now the question is the Narega actually a model that should be followed for urban areas, keeping in mind that the Narega was and still is essentially a distress scheme. When people are distressed and they don't have work in agriculture, then the Act specifies 100 days of work at a minimum wage. But is this something that will satisfy the needs of the urban working class? Keeping in mind that a substantial portion of the urban working class is self employed, 43% according to the latest NSO survey, which may have changed after the lockdown, 41% which is salaried, and only 17% which is on contract. So given that kind of a pattern, is Narega the model for secure employment in urban areas, or do we need a different kind of model? And if we need a different kind of model, then what should be the basic elements of that model? So these are the two themes I would urge you to focus your thoughts on. Firstly, can workers plan? If yes, how? Secondly, Is Narega the optimum model for urban employment? And if not, then what are the other ideas that we can think of? With that, I will first ask my old friend KP Kannan, who, and I ask him particularly because he was part of the Nirmal Sengupta working committee on the unorganized sector, and he was also part of the Kerala People's Plan. So I hope that he will be able to throw some good issues across and make some valid points on which we can think further. Kannan, over to you.
Okay, good evening to everyone. I know some people here, apart from Dunu. I've met Amarjeet ji. I know Gautam. I know Kirti Shah. And it's a pleasure to meet other panelists. Well, I listened to Dunu carefully, but I also read the notes that he sent me. I'm in broad agreement with the contents and the proposal that he has put forward for discussion. So I pushed him, and I think he came out with these two objectives. One is that what would be the main elements of a city design from a worker's point of view? And the second is an urban employment guarantee scheme desirable and or workable? If so, what are the considerations? I will not spend much time on the first question because I'm not a city planner. I don't have the kind of expertise that Kirti Shah and others have, and some of you who are associated with INHAF, you know much better, and you have been conducting several thematic seminars on this. But as a social scientist, um, although Dunu has raised this question from a worker's perspective, it's a right question, but at a fairly wrong time, politically speaking. The workers' unions and workers themselves are struggling to hold on to what they have achieved so far. And the kind of labor reforms that we have witnessed is certainly not a progressive one. In many respects, it's my understanding that it is a regressive one, including the threat to minimum or the hours of work and many other aspects of social security, minimum wages, and so on. But I think in a democracy, I think what Dunu said is right, that we should keep on asking questions and raising issues and desirably articulate them in as socially meaningful way as we can. So the first objective, while I endorse that first objective, all that I would say at this point is that we need a larger canvas when we talk about city or urban spatial planning, or even overall planning, when spatial planning has to be married to the economic, commercial, and social requirements. So all that I can say that we need a larger canvas giving a clear argument for urban spaces that are, in my view, environmentally sustainable, a short term for facing all the challenges we are now facing. The IPCC sixth report, some of you might have seen just now released. It's such a, I think, scary scenario, and it's all based on scientific evidence. They are not writing fiction, as we know. So it has to be environmentally sustainable, and the details of which will vary from city to city, because there are local level issues of environmental sustainability, whether it is of pollution or waste management or the high energy building construction, so on and so forth. So we need to argue for retrofitting or redesigning the city spaces to meet the challenge of environmental sustainability. And in my view, we can come later, either in this session or later, that when you do that, when you take up that objective of greening the cities as a short term for environmental sustainability, there is enormous scope for generating employment, because it requires a lot of technological organizational changes in the way we live in cities, work, travel, and so on, reskilling. A whole range of issues will come up. And I must tell you, theoretically speaking, enormous opportunities for new employment creation. But we should keep in mind such new employment creation will take place along with employment destruction. And that because all the technologies like the transportation systems and various other things will also go away. What will be the net result is something which I don't think in India we have a grip on, because such issues have not been subjected to detailed exercises, let alone planning, because there is no planning. Nobody speaks about planning. So that's one of the challenges. Apart from that, I think when we argue for a new city or a redeveloped city space, urban space, it has to be socially inclusive. I think any economic problem or issue that we take up in India today has a social corollary, and it is related to the historical baggage that we have of a very hierarchical society that excludes large sections of people from even seeking opportunities. And that's a big challenge, although governments will claim that we have done this, that, and so on and so forth. If you look at the numbers and statistics, we have a long way to go in terms of attaining a modicum of social equality. My own work, I have found that social inequality is increasing in pari passu with economic inequality. So that's a different point that I want to make. Socially inclusive and taking care of the hitherto excluded needs of the laboring poor or vulnerable workers. I suppose when we talk about workers in urban spaces, we are mostly talking about vulnerable workers, because others are able to take care of themselves. Not that they don't need any redesigning or a much more welding with the new challenges of environmental sustainability. They do, but I think there is a much more urgent need for advocacy group like this team to focus on the poor and vulnerable workers in the urban space. So let me deal a bit with the second objective, in which I feel a bit more confident to talk about. The proposal for an urban employment guarantee as a right-based scheme, I would say, is eminently desirable. I will not say it is a compulsive demand at this point in time, because the objective has to be to generate more employment. In a situation like in our country, when more employment is getting destroyed than created. And therefore some of us lost, statistically and empirically wrote about the process of jobless growth and even talked about job loss growth. There is some minor recovery from 1978 because the devastation that caused decline in employment as a result of monetization has been so heavy that the 1718 statistics showed a larger decline in employment, absolute decline. But by 1920 or 1819, there has been a somewhat recovery, but that means employment is stagnating. You have more people coming into the working age group, but you don't have additional employment being created. So that's it. So I would say right to employment is certainly could be taken up as a starting point, but not an exclusive one. I would put forward 4 agenda for this second objective. What would I put first? The need to create work or minimum wages? From my own work and that of my colleagues as well as in the commission, what we found, to not to our dismay, but not very popularly understood, the biggest challenge in our country is not employment creation per se. It is the problem of working poor. So if you take the incidence of poverty in whatever way you want to measure, whether national line or international line, you will find 93 to 94% of those households where people are there, people are poor, they are also working, which means they get a wage that may well be called a starvation wage. That means you are not able to make out a living that will take care of your basic minimum requirements. So the biggest challenge in our country, whether it is rural or urban, but we can have an urban focused one without denying the same thing for rural workers, is about the minimum wage. I know many trade unions have already been campaigning for minimum wages, and one of them, or not one of them, one of their demands was to have at least 18,000 rupees. I did not know how exactly they worked out the 18,000 rupees per month. But as I think of it more and more, I realized that this 18,000 rupees happily coincides with the international poverty line of $2, two purchasing power dollars a day per capita, which is now, because there is a dollar inflation, which is also, which is now $3.2 per day per person. So if that is the thing, it will require something like 600 rupees per capita, and not 600 rupees. That will $3.2 purchasing power dollars will be around 65 rupees. So 65 rupees into 5 people on an average in a family. So it's about 300 and between 300 and 330 or something like that. So you have um, yes, 300, about 10,000 rupees a month at the minimum, So that's what it requires. But then we also have interestingly, a committee that has been set up, or that was set up in 2017 by this government, Satpathy Committee. Satpathy is a young economist, who is no longer young, but very well known to me, a very committed scholar, pure scholar. And he and the members of that committee, along with technical expertise from the ILO, they worked out a minimum wage rate of 375 rupees per day per worker for 2018. And this is a national average. They divided into 4 zones that will range from 350 to 420 rupees where you are located. But that's matter of detail. But the government of India, in which their own officials of the ministry were part of this committee as members, they promptly rejected it and in a way mocked the laboring poor by sticking on to the recommended national minimum, which is half of what was recommended, more or less 190 rupees, 190 to 200 rupees, and they increased it by 2 rupees at that time. It's almost like a mockery and making fun of the working people, or especially the laboring poor. So I think so. If you now adjust that 375 to inflation, so at today's current prices, it will come to around 430 rupees or so. So I think the first fight has to be for a minimum wage, and in the urban context, it has a great significance because a significant part of the urban vulnerable workers are poor, not only poor, but also come from rural areas. So this is where in the notes that when you say, Dunu, that rural workers have something to fall back in terms of land and resources and all that, that's only for a small section of the rural workers. 30% of the rural workers are, not 30%, I think. Yes, 30% of the rural workers are casual wage workers, And then in this so-called self-employed rural workers, most of them are marginal farmers, less than 1 hectare a day. Also land poor and land less. So they don't have much of an asset. So this has a relevant spillover effect to rural areas or the other way around. The second component of this could be the right to work, and that could be in the form of an urban guarantee. I don't know whether how far the guarantee will work. We can discuss the details later, because the NREGA, although the framework is very robust and the initiative is very welcome, I call it a half-hearted half initiative, because the system limited the implementation of that by first saying only 100 days per family, not per person. So if you take the average laboring household in India, the number of workers is around 1.7. So what you are basically saying under NREG, what you are entitled to is a 60 days work per capita. 100 days per family translates itself to 60 days per capita. That's about 2.5 months keeping you working. So its potential has not yet been realized because of this artificial limitation in the name of fiscal this thing. But you know how much money is being spent on things which are absolutely vulgar and not even, should be part of our national budget. So that's.
Can I ask you to?
I will take one more minute, and
Okay, good.
I'm sorry I took a little more time than I planned. The third one is a right to a national minimum social security. This was also articulated by the Commission. There are schemes and all that. We have to put it under the screen and see whether it adds up to a basic minimum social security. And the fourth one is the minimum conditions of work. And I think the labor reforms have really made fun of the conditions of work situation. Instead of enhancing the conditions of work, they have tried to push it backwards. But what is the significance of these conditions of work? I would say conditions of work and life. And in that, I would argue for a immediate agenda of housing. The housing and related amenities, drinking water and sanitation. Because a worker is more vulnerable when he doesn't have a place to stay in a decent manner. And you have seen that after the demonetization and also the corona, when millions of people walked back to their villages. So you also see the connection with rural areas. So when you are talking about urban vulnerable workers, you are really addressing the problem of poor workers who come from rural areas. So we need to keep that it's the two sides of the same coin, and that we have to take up that. And in a federal setup, I would say the conceptual framework of whatever you advocate have to be fitted into, and one is what the union government or the larger state should do, and what the regional state, the state governments could do. My argument that goes along with the Commission's argument, which I served, is that the national level should provide the basic minimum, and there should be scope for regional add-on facilities, add-on space for state governments. So there will be a healthy competition and also take the local situation into account. I'll stop at that. I'm sorry I took a little more time than I deserve.
Thank you. But you've laid out the ground very well. So I will not attempt to interpret it further. All the participants have heard what you have had to say. Since Kavita is not there, she was supposed to be the second speaker. Could I request Comrade Amarjeet to take up the thread? Comrade Amarjeet is, as you all know, has been very active in the workers' front. She's General Secretary of the ITUC, and she has been very vocal on many issues affecting labor in the last few years. And it's a pleasure to have her here. Comrade Amarjeet.
Thank you, Comrade Dunu. I'm sorry I could not listen to the first speaker, and then Kannan ji also I could not listen to him fully because as I entered the webinar, I had to suddenly, our president came from Ranchi, from airport straight. which was a sudden program. So I had to in between switch off my camera and talk to him. So I could listen to Kannan ji to some extent, but the very first speaker I did not listen to. I would like to be very brief and sharp on points, because background must have been told by the first speaker. Then Dunu ji was speaking. After that, he called Kannan ji, and then in between I had to miss also. We are talking of urban situation of our working people. In this COVID, the situation became very, very bad. All of us know it. I need not repeat. Second thing which has happened is that continuously the change of work situations, the production ways, the ways of assembling, the ways of dispersal, this keeps changing, and then the work profile keeps changing. This also has been happening. So new kind of workers who are out of any coverage of labor legislations, they also appear to be happening. And in the note which was circulated by Comrade Dunu, it is mentioned about those things also, like talking about Zomato workers, and there are several of the workers one can name about it, and some kind of workers increasing in urban areas and some kinds of workers getting reduced in urban areas depending on the civic policies also. Like domestic workers increased in India in the cities coming from tribal areas. And in Delhi itself, if you talk about it, it's not only 1 lakh, it was much more than 1 lakh workers coming from Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh, and most of them women coming from there. But after this COVID situation, many of them had to go back, and many could not come back. Like some from industry and other areas also, many workers could not come back. So women also could not come back. So the things keep changing. For example, the rickshaw pulling used to be about 4 lakh workers in Delhi, but then suddenly when e-rickshaw got introduced, so rickshaw pullers were out of the job. Then they were limited to certain areas, and then that profession started getting limited and all. So in this manner, the professions also keep adding, works keep adding, and the works keep you see vanishing also. This is also a scenario. When we talk about urban areas, we have to keep that in mind. Secondly, wage Kannan ji was talking about, and he mentioned about minimum wage being considered from the point of view of poverty line, and how many dollars per day for the family per capita and all he was talking about. But if you talk from trade union point of view, we had a big debate in India. In Indian constitution, it was a living wage, but then living wage was not provided. Minimum Wages Act was there. So a fair wage committee was formed in India. And that Fair Wage Committee came out with its recommendations. Even those were not implemented. And ultimately, minimum wages continue. In that whole debate in 1957 in Indian Labour Conference, the whole discussion happened, how will you calculate minimum wages? And in that calculation, they had zeroed on to 2,700 calorie requirement. And some managements went and challenged it in Supreme Court. It became a famous case, Raptakos case. And the Supreme Court endorsed the Indian Labour Conference recommendation. And plus Supreme Court said, this is not sufficient. You have to add rent. You have to add education component of their children. You have to add some basic amenities for them. So on the calculation which was made by Indian Labour Conference, Supreme Court rather said you have to have 25% add-on into it. So that became the principle in India. A tripartite body recommended that this should be the standard of calculating minimum wages in India. And if we want to talk about dignified way of working and having a minimum wage component appropriately, be it the question of Manrega or be it the question of urban employment guarantee if we ask, or urban employment scheme if we ask, and if we will be talking in connection with minimum wages, then we have to keep that in mind. 18,000 which was being talked about, it came out of this only. Because that 15th Indian Labour Conference was held in 1957. So based on that formula, and if you look at Supreme Court judgment, then it came out to be calculated to the tune of 10,000 rupees in 2009. So when the trade unions formed their platform, and 11 central trade unions were together, even including BMS at that time and INTUC also, we calculated and we made it 10,000 as a demand. After 3 years, we reviewed it and made it 15,000 rupees as a demand, because the price rise situation was there. And when 7th Pay Commission was constituted, in the 7th Pay Commission itself, they recommended 18,000. And the government, and it was for contract labor in the central government establishments, not the regular workers, the contract labor. It was for them, this 18,000 suggested. And the union said it should be 26,000. And then ultimately, committee set up by the government agreed for 21,000. But the central government unilaterally, suddenly, immediately notified for 18,000. Now, this 18,000 collection is not, whole calculation is not ours. It was the calculation by the central government's, that committee which was talking about 7th Pay Commission. And this 18,000 was the lowest slab for the contract workers in the central government establishments. And that is why we said, why not our 15,000 rupees demand be raised to 18,000 when the government is accepting that the contract workers can have that much in the central government establishments. So that is how this 18,000 was reached. If we talk of 2,700 calories plus 25% add on to it, after all, they have to live, they have to have clean drinking water, they have to have sanitation facilities, their children have to study. So it's not a question of only eating, it's a question of living also with dignity. And it's question of their next generation having facilities of education, and not only for getting literate, proper education facilities through good government institutes and the government schools. So those requirements, if we are talking about urban labor, we have to look into all these questions. And that is how we did not accept Saptapati committee at that time, when it said that it should be around about 375 rupees per day. Because at that time, our demand was 665 rupees near about, we were saying that should be, which was coming to the tune of about 18,000 rupees. So we said that Saptapati committee falls too short of our this thing. And we said that the government announced, oh, we are giving them more than 600 rupees per day we have announced, but they camouflaged. What had happened is they were talking about 7th Pay Commission to cover only about a few lakh of workers in the central establishment. And that was not meant for the workers even of the state government employees, or even the public sector, or even of the private sector, the big sector, the formal sector. It was only related to that the government tried to befool the people, because we had given a call of strike. So at that stage, we had to say that government is telling lie, because this coverage of 657 rupees per day is meant only for a few lakh. And we are talking about crores of workers in India who are in informal economy. 93% of them are in informal economy. Even announced minimum wages are also not being given to them. I am sitting here in Delhi. Delhi government announced 16,000. And when the government announced 16,000, beginning from 14,000, 15, then 16, different slabs are there, unskilled, semi-skilled, then skilled, those slabs are there. And then somebody went to challenge it in High Court. And then High Court said, no, nothing doing. Whatever has been announced by the Delhi government should be implemented. But do you know that workers are not getting that 16,000, they get only 7,000 and 8,000? Implementation is a serious issue in our country. So when we will be talking about facilities for workers, their wages, no wages be cut, their social security coverage, their question of occupational safety health at the workplace, or their question of living conditions and basic minimum needs to be given to them. If we look at that thing, we have to look at the implementation part. Be it governance, who has to implement and deliver those facilities which they are supposed to give to workers or their families or in their bastis, or it is the question of wages or the occupational safety health measure at the workplace. So from that point of view, I think when we will be talking about what kind of facilities worker will be wanting, what do they want to do they want to have the question raised is should work be regular or on demand? What should be the wage when this question is raised? When the question has been raised by the concept note which is circulated, if work is not available, then who is to be held accountable? I think it has to be on demand also. It has to be regular wages because there are different variety of workers. So perennial nature of work will have, we should insist on our Contract Act legislation we have in India, which this government is trying to repeal through codification, which said that any work of perennial nature must be a regular work, and so you should give a regular job to the workers. But the work which will come only for little time, for a few months, or on a construction project which can be for 3 months or 6 months, then some other place you will be having construction project or some other kind of project or of any production unit in any sector in industrial area which is based on the orders from abroad or from other states. There the workers will be deployed time to time, can't be kept fully by them, and law allows them to do it. So if that is the situation, you will have a wage related, so that we ensure that even if they are short time, then the minimum wages are guaranteed to them. Occupational safety health is guaranteed to them. A minimum of their living standards are met with that. So all those things we will have to, and their compensation in place of work if any accidents or anything else happen. So from that point of view, so that is why the questions which are being raised, then these regular and wage related both will have to be there, and wage should be applicable to both. There is no question that those who will be for some time, their wage should be less, or those who will be regular, their wage has to be more. It has to be calculated on the basis of wages as calculated in India, and it has to be that, because our demand has been equal pay for equal work. You may be regular or you may be outsourced worker. So our demand is that payment should be equal when qualification, designation, and the work and the output is same. How come you are paying less? They are paying half wage to the outsourced work, highly qualified person in the public sector and in the government sector, half than what the regular worker is getting for the same work and same output and same number of working hours, even rather more working hours sometimes. So we have been saying it. So we know that these problems are there, but when we talk of wage, wage means wage. And once you decide minimum wage, that is wage. Our fear is that the government is trying to replace minimum wages and make floor level wage as the norm. We are saying minimum wage has to remain, though all those people who are covered through minimum wages must get minimum wages. For them, no question of floor level wage. All those people who are yet not into the schedule and they are not covered under Minimum Wages Act, all those people till they reach that stage, then you can say this is the floor level. Below that nobody will be paying them. They have to be paid. Then we can understand if somebody talks of floor level wage, that means minimum subsistence level wage, you have to keep it. And that is what the poverty line wage is being talked about the world over, so many dollars, this, that. That is only for living, remaining alive. Only for eating, sleeping and remaining alive with 2 clothes. That is not wage with dignity as per fundamental rights in Indian Constitution. If I talk of work and living wage, even if minimum wage, and then living with dignity, if I talk about that, then it is minimum wage. Rather, from there, we have to go towards fair wage and living wage. So we cannot accept living wage as none. But the danger is the government introduced wage code in parliament, and their minister, while introducing, talked of 178 rupees as a floor level wage. And speaking in the podium at parliament, he is saying that, denying his own Satpathy committee, which talked about 300 something, means 356 or 375, I don't exactly remember this thing, what Satpathy committee said. It is in between that 356 and 375. So they wanted to take us to that level. So wage will be serious issue when we are debating about employment for the urban areas. And then who will be accountable? Government should be accountable. Departments should be accountable.
Amarjeet,
I will conclude.
I ask you to. Yeah.
And then I only list the points which are necessary when we are debating. There has to be the basics need to be met for all workers, regular, migrant, formal, informal employees, whosoever they are. You call them migrant or non-migrant, whosoever. Basic minimum has to be given by the state. Education facilities, health facilities, sanitation facilities, clean drinking water facilities, public transport facilities, it should come from government. They should not be too much dependent on private transportation. Then the universal public distribution system, de-linked from this APL, BPL or any Aadhaar card. It should be really universal to deal with the question of hunger. And then, of course, the jobs on demand based ad Manrega talks about. Until, and this scheme should not be bureaucratic scheme, because during Manrega also we had a debate. They wanted a bureaucratic scheme, and we said no, this scheme has to be an Parliament Act. So it became Parliament Act. So anything which we will be achieving in that question should be through Parliament. And you remember in the beginning, Narendra Modi had said this Manrega is in a way nuisance. He wanted to shed it actually, and he said, "Main boja dho raha hu." And it is that Manrega which became a saving feature during COVID time for the people who went to the rural India. So we knew that had it not been through Parliament, MG Narega would have been wound up in 2014 or 15. So any kind of schemes or programs which we want to seek, that has to be through Parliament and then through the state legislations. It is a must. So we cannot think in terms of less than 16,000 which Delhi government is giving, which we have already told Delhi government the wages are less. And we are already telling them that the workers' needs of living and properly living and their basic needs to be met at the areas, that has to be covered. We have been telling all these issues. So this debate will continue. We will have to look into all those issues which are raised on the aspects of caste, gender, communal tendencies, etc. This is growing in city, and we are sitting in Delhi. We know what happened in Jantar Mantar, and how only after hue and cry 6 people are arrested. But those who came to protest against that kind of communal agenda, they were bundled into the buses and sent back. So cities are vulnerable now for these kinds of communal tensions. So that will create too much problem for our workforce wherever they will be working or they will be living. So we cannot leave this agenda. And women they were worst sufferers during COVID. They have lost jobs. Their percentage in the labor force has fallen badly. Children have worst sufferers because 4.9 crore more children are going to be added into the child labor in India. So these are vulnerable sections, and the caste hierarchy in our country, we know every day the kind of stories come. Those things, of course, we will have to keep in mind when we design about these policies, or we present representations to the government, or we come out with alternate kind of legislation to be given to some MPs, put it in the parliament if the government is not ready to come. So we might go ahead for urban employment guarantee scheme, some kind of a program we make, and we prepare it, and we tell some MPs to introduce from various political parties. They can gather together and introduce it as a non-government bill also. So that can be done. So all the best. Some facts and figures have been given in this concept paper. I have taken note of, I have not repeated those. But I was too much worked up on this wage issue, because all those people who could rejoin, their wages are cut. And almost 40 to 50% people could rejoin, others could not join. In this whole NCR region, the figures from Noida, from Gurgaon, and within Delhi industrial areas, we know what is happening over there. So they tell them, तुम 15,000 पे काम करते थे, अब 10,000 पे काम करने को तैयार हो तो आ जाओ. I'm receiving Maruti boys here coming from Gurgaon area and telling कि मैम हमें 18,000 मिलता था, अब वो हम निकाल दिए गए, बहुत लोगों को दोबारा ज्वाइनिंग नहीं मिला, अब जा रहे हैं तो वो कह रहे हैं 10,000 में काम कर लो 9,000 में. So there is already wage cuts happening, retrenchments going on, lockdown wages not given. The workers are in really bad shape in urban area also. We need to do something, and Comrade Dunu, it is a good initiative you have taken up and brought everybody together, and this discussion must go on.
Thank you. Yes, we need to make space for this discussion. Before I ask Gautam, Mody to intervene in this, just to flag the three issues that have come up so far. One is the creation of work itself, so that employment is there. The second is the payment of a living wage, which takes care of the worker, the worker's family, and all his or her needs. And the third is that there are environmental constraints that are emerging in all cities, a very important point made by Kannan. And within those environmental constraints, how do we figure out employment and wage, particularly in the context of the fact that all urban planning at the moment is going completely against this. Urban planning is essentially privatizing everything from housing to work to water, electricity, everything is going to private firms. So within that context, I would now invite Gautam Mody, who is from the National Trade Union Initiative, an initiative that began actually to consider these new forms of economic activity and therefore new forms of labor organization that are required. Gautam, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for putting this very important group together and all the effort that's gone in and asking me to join it. We're, just to remind you, Dunu, we're not the National Trade Union Initiative, we're the New Trade Union Initiative. No worries, most people make that mistake. We weren't very sure about the nation really, and still are not. And so I begin by paying tribute to those who have fallen from the attacks of this authoritarian and bigoted government, and those who continue to be incarcerated in its jails, some of whom in fact might have joined us to speak and certainly attend a webinar like this. You know, speaking after Kannan and Amarjeet, there's very little left to say. But let me see if I can add something to this. There's, you know, one thing that I think we really must, I believe, put up front. Before we talk about the right to work, we should go back to the 20th century urge for full employment. And that was a central part of public policy across countries of the 20th century. That's what the post-war Second World War Compact was meant to deliver. And actually what we've learned from history is actually there are only 2 instances since employment records have been kept when society actually achieved full employment. From the early 1950s to the early 1970s in the so-called advanced world. And the second instance was the Soviet Union. I think at the 100th year of the Chinese Communist Party, we should perhaps note that China is far from achieving full employment. But I say that because ultimately it's in capitalism's interest to maintain, as we all know, as high a possible level of unemployment as. Then it comes to societies like ours and China's and elsewhere in the global south, where we've never even approximated. And I think that, to me, is a defining set of goals to push for a set of political outcomes that create policies that not just create full employment, but full productive employment, and therefore to ensure that we expand the productive capacities of our societies while allowing them to remain sustainable. I think that argument must not go away. And I think we have a role to play as unions, women's organizations, the progressive movement at large. There's a very large swath of workers, both urban and rural, but especially urban, who don't even know what the minimum wage is today. And somewhere we need to take a little responsibility for that failure. They don't know what an 8-hour workday is. And I think this part of when we address what our cities or our country or our society or our countryside should look like, that has to also include an agenda for redoubling our efforts to build politically strong trade unions and other social movements. I would put that as part of what is an agenda to achieve. There's the second part of this agenda, and I said the right to the minimum wage. I think the right to the minimum wage, and I'm not going to get into details of how a minimum wage might be computed. I think we've been widely debated within the Indian Trade Union. But I think we have to recognize that being able to not just achieve a minimum wage, but to ensure that it's enforced rigorously and robustly, and any violation of it is a punitive offense which is acted upon is important. And it's important to plug the floor of a surplus labor economy. Somewhere, I mean, if we're talking about, an expansion of productive forces, which provides productive employment, then there has to be a base level wage, which it provides for decent life, quality of life. I don't have a whole lot, I have to say, about how workers may contribute to a city, to the planning of a city. All I can say is, someone who's led a lot of unions at one point at the plant level in the engineering industry, I used to turn down to engineers and ask them, could they run those fancy factories with all those fancy gadgetry, electronic machines, new production techniques, without workers with 20 years of experience, 30 years of experience? And the best trained engineers in the country, who were honest, actually said, no, workers teach us how to run the factory. So that's about, I think the point about planning and bringing people in, bringing workers in, is actually about creating democratic institutions of planning, which of course I believe we have experiences of both in this country and elsewhere. I am not going to dwell too long on how a city might be reconstituted or restructured. Yes, it has to be environmentally sustainable, and that would be a non-negotiable. But I think I would also define it as one that provides access to wage goods for all at affordable prices, which then affordable price then is also reflected. I turn to what I think are two challenges of urban right to work. The urban right to work cannot be like the NREJ, including for the fact that we cannot have the scale of public works that are possible in the countryside. And urban rights to work will have to include a component of employment provision in private enterprises, and therefore an implicit wage subsidy to private enterprises. How that subsidy is translated, whether it's actually a cash transfer to ensure minimum wage payment, or the wages paid by a public authority in lieu of wages to be paid by the employer, or it's a fiscal subsidy in terms of tax breaks, etc. These are things that we need to debate very, very carefully. Second part of such a program, I think, does mean looking at the public space, looking at the role of petty contractors, etc., and seeing how we can actually corporatize some of this activity to be able to actually remove profit share, but also remove the money that's skimmed off by the contractor and ensure that it results in the minimum. But finally, I think, and I turn to the last part of what I want to say, there is nowhere in society that a worker is more discriminated than the urban space. And there is no worker who is more discriminated in the urban space than the woman. And I think if we look at all our data points of the declining share of workforce participation, first, the declining number of jobs for women workers, second, the declining labor force participation, clearly brings out two things about our society today. One, when there's a crunch of jobs, women are the first to lose it. Second, with even just a little bit better healthcare we've had in these 60 or 70 years, with life expectancy growing, with a little better opportunity of child schooling, there is a certain amount of care work that's involved at home. So one, women are discriminated outside in the workplace or in the labor market. Second, they're discriminated because of the double burden that they carry in terms of homework, housework, in terms of care work. I think starting as a progressive society, an urban right to work must begin not as a targeted exercise, but one that is targeted for women workers. Singularly addresses the question of the double burden, seeks to socialize it, and socialize it, I believe, from our part, and that's for us to think about, us to take forward. If we really believe that the capacity must belong to the people, then it's about building cooperatives from our movement. And not gigantic Amul-style cooperatives, which is in a way what has been part of our national project. But tiny cooperatives, tiny forms of workplace participation, tiny coming together of food co-ops, of kitchen co-ops, of laundry co-ops, really which take the drudgery of work and the hours of work a woman puts in to be able to work in such a place and receive the minimum wage, man or woman, to actually be able to buy the services from a service provider like this at a reasonable cost and be able to go out and work. I think these would be, in my view, critical starting points to an urban employment guarantee. But I think absolute bottom line of it is this would all be a pie in the sky unless we can very aggressively address the minimum wage and then address the minimum wage, achieving a just minimum wage, which is enforced with penal offenses. And yes, I think our challenge today is to repeal the labor codes, to fight back for what we've lost, and to take the charge forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Gautam. Can I just ask Kavita? Kavita, are you?
Sure. Yeah.
No, you can start, yeah? Okay.
Yeah.
Just to give you a little background, that this issue of wage has been greatly debated, as well as the issue of falling employment. So if you can take off from there. Kavita Krishnan is, well, I don't know whether I should introduce you at any length, but Kavita has been very vocal in the last few years on issues of gender in particular, as well as of workers, and this migration that has been taking place is something that has deeply concerned her. So you are ideally situated to take this discussion forward. Over to you.
Thank you. I'm glad that you've initiated this discussion, which I'll tell you first how I see this discussion, in a sense that I don't think we are in a situation where we are really in a position to come up with a good plan and then hope for the government to actually adopt it. I don't think that this government is of that nature, and it doesn't have that. I think of this more in terms of developing something which can become a popular rallying point and a focal point, and something that can be then much more widely discussed, more democratically discussed among people in general. So I think of this meeting, today's meeting, as sort of towards that. And of course, absolutely right that we are seeing a historic, unprecedented levels of unemployment right now, and distress right now. And rural distress, a lot we have written and thought about, but urban distress certainly it is, and in many, many ways, for instance, I think that every crisis that has hit us in the past several years, you can see the impact it has had on urban working class society. So whether it is demonetization, whether it is COVID, and the kind of impact the disease itself has, the virus itself has on urban slums and urban poor, urban working class, as well as the effect of the lockdowns and the effect of the effect on migrant workers in the cities, the effect of the exodus of migrant workers in the on the cities, and all of this, and the current second wave of COVID also has highlighted, the crisis of healthcare, which is generally used to be considered, that the healthcare crisis was for those who could not afford it, and it was in rural India out of everyone's sight. But it has clearly come home now that it is, the crisis exists in our biggest cities, and it exists, it is not even able to provide for those who have the money to pay for it, let alone those who have nothing and cannot pay for it. So in this context, I think, how do we visualize the right to work in an urban context? I think that for that, my suggestion is that, if we were to think about it in terms of how we visualize essential work, because if anything has been brought home by COVID internationally, it is the idea of what is it that is absolutely essential work that you cannot do without. How do you better understand that? And after all, that is the work that sustains life. Those are the kinds of work that are there to create and provide for and nurture people's lives, right? So if you think about those jobs and the fact that we have so few people actually to do those jobs, and the ones who are doing those jobs are remunerated so poorly, and if we were to visualize a right to work scheme around that kind of work, saying that, so it would be absolutely crystal clear that this is not money being handed out for doing, for marching in place, for doing nothing. This is absolutely not that. So it should also be propagated as such, that this is a scheme which is intended to provide the benefits of this work to society as a whole, and to make sure that those doing this work are remunerated. So if you were to look at it that way, then of course, some of the work already we know, such as sanitation work, such as such as health workers in various capacities. The fact that you need many more of these, you need many more people running the Anganwadis, you need many more women running Anganwadis, you need many more ashas, you need them to be remunerated properly. You need, and obviously, I mean, the fact that they should be treated on par with government employees, actually. This is not a question, here the answer would not be to just hand out some 500 rupees or something like that as a token amount. It is actually about visualizing what is it which is a wage, which is, which would be dignified employment in a sense. The other kinds of work, of course, would also mean there's a lot of, in the current health situations, there are a lot of forms of work that have come up, haven't they? So in terms of even creating awareness about COVID, ensuring that people understand how to use a mask, how to clean masks regularly to avoid black fungus and so on, how to, even these. So many unemployed young people who would be very good at, at communicating, and if they have a degree of a level of education, be very good at communicating these things and ensuring that people actually have access to everything they need in order to, and even a network of information about health, failing health and so on. The realization that even if you have a cough and cold, you won't be blamed if you say that, well, I have a cough and a cold and it could be something else. So please make sure that I have the care I need. So a lot of the caring at home and so on. Cooking for families who are cooking and providing cooked food, good meals for families who are affected by diseases, who need help at home. These are all things we realize now in this pandemic that are needed. Apart from that, I think if you look at more long-term kind of things, women have been saying for so long that you need childcare, you need creches for, especially in urban slums, where you have a high level of complaints of child sexual abuse, precisely because children are left unattended there and children are in a particularly vulnerable situation there. The very fact that, at least in my organization's experience, the worst instances of child sexual abuse tend to be reported from urban slums in Delhi slums, because, and you see the situations there and you see that children are basically completely, small children are left unsupervised and, without an effective system of child care. So if you were actually to be, think of an urban employment guarantee scheme, which were to find hands for these jobs. These are jobs that are needed. These are jobs that are a felt need. These jobs would be welcomed by people saying, yes, absolutely, this is a felt need. We want this job done. And if you could find people, especially women, to do these jobs, that would be another big thing. One of the things I think which we need to think about how we understand it, it's a puzzle for me also, is the fact that a large number of what passes for work, especially with the lockdown and all, it has become even more sort of institutionalized, is the fact that a lot of women are doing, this kind of piece work from home and so on. So it is officially, they are employed, but the kind of employment they are doing is extremely exploitative. It is working from home. You're getting paid according to what, the number of things that you are producing, number of pieces of cloth or embroidery or whatever it is that you are producing. And it is claimed that you are doing it in your spare time. So it is not seen that you are doing a full-time job, right? You actually have policymakers saying, oh, women, they have a lot of time on their hands and they wasted gossiping and watching TV. And so this is all work that is there to fill up their free time. So the fact that in fact they have no free time and that they are doing this while juggling, housework and all of that together. So how do you and the fact that they are paid extremely poorly. So how do you understand a minimum wage in that context? What would a minimum wage look like? How would you even begin to enforce it? And how would you conceive of democratizing that environment where the work environment is actually the household, which is not at all a democratic space, right? I don't have an easy answer for that, but I think that that is also something to think about. And I do think that if other remunerative employment were to be created, then perhaps this situation would also change. So in short, I think, okay, one more thing which I was thinking about was even say living spaces. I'm seeing now that, people who lived under flyovers and so on. What is happening now is that the homeless are being taken away from those spaces, and those spaces are being converted into so-called green zones and so on. Okay. So in fact, I think what would be a very ambitious and necessary project would be to actually revisualize the green zones in the city, to say that the parks are for people, to say that the parks are actually, places for people, and they are places where people should be able to get a night's sleep. They are places under flyovers should be a hospitable space for people to actually get a night's sleep, and so on and so forth. If you were to actually, and if people were to get work actually caring for those spaces, caring for the green spots in the city, caring for people who basically live in those spots in the city, making those spots more hospitable and more habitable. I think even that would be an important way to kind of revisualize how we think about the city. So these are just my thoughts for now. And in short, basically, I think the idea of wages and a dignified employment, those need to be thought about while we think about an employment scheme, an employment guarantee scheme, or the right to work.
Thank you so much, Kavita, for throwing fresh light and a different interpretation of these spaces and these functions in the city. So now, can I call on Clifton? Clifton, are you there?
Yeah.
Oh, good. So Clifton Rozario, he is with AICCTU, been very active on that for many years in Maharashtra and other places. And I think to be able to perceive these things from a worker's perspective, I would just remind everybody that, in Nagpur was one of the first industrial townships. So there's a history of industrial townships designed around work, and whether we can reimagine some of that in today's discussion. Over to you, Clifton.
Hi, thanks, Dunu. And actually, really thanks to you for your perseverance in ensuring that this we came through. Yeah, really grateful to you for that. Just some thoughts. I mean, I don't think that one has spent given too much of really that kind of thought to how one can imagine an urban right to work. So there's certain thoughts that I have which I'd like to throw out, where I think I look at this more as the beginning of some kind of a process towards in a long journey. I think in arriving at how we would actually be able to conceptualize an urban right to work. Even as we do this meeting today, there are thousands, perhaps lakhs of workers whose houses are being broken in Koregaon, in around Delhi, in Haryana. And it's so angering. I mean, just to say, and that's something that happens relentlessly. And I think the point, one of the takeaways for me from something like that, which is not just a takeaway, I think it is a relentless, it's a relentless way in which workers are consistently made to believe that the city is not yours, and this sense of alienation that you have to internalize vis-a-vis the very space that you have built. So to give a very small example, migrant workers in general, construction workers build the city. So they're building the malls, they're building the metros, they're building everything. They're building high apartments and swimming pools, etc. Most of which, or 99% of which, they will never be able to see ever again in their lives. A wall that they would have shed their blood to put up, something that they'll never be able to touch again. A mall where they'll never be able to step into. Um, and the way the metros are going, perhaps there'll be a day where they won't even be able to ride it. So in that sense, the very city that is being built and the very labor that is building it, there's such a sense of disconnect over there. This It's almost like it's the tools of labor being used to build your own chains, as it were. So I think when which is why I'm very curious as to how, because for me, urban right to work cannot be divorced from right to the city. And in fact, I think that it has to go together. And I'm not saying that this is different for an urban space as opposed to a rural area. Not for a moment am I making that argument. I think that's something we're not getting into. But insofar as the city is concerned, I think even in conceptualizing a right to the city, a right to work, a person's right to work in the city, I think one needs to also look at how that is linked to the person's right in that city. So that is the first point I'd like to make. The second thing, the reason I also say that is, if you look at even how cities are being structured today, or for instance, say, how is it that a city is being planned? Who are the people who are taking decisions? And you'll always find these extra constitutional kind of authorities. In Karnataka, we've seen agencies such as the Bangalore Agenda Task Force, as late, this was maybe in the mid 90s, where you had all your Nandan Nilakenis and Kiran Majumdars and all your rich friends who are just get together. They have a friendly chief minister in SM Krishna at that time. They form something called the Agenda Task Force that literally sets the agenda for the city in terms of how money, budgetary allocations are going to be made, what is the form of development that takes place. Now, this particular body morphs into it takes various other forms as governments change. So recently, when our government fell and SR Bommai became uh, the um, the chief minister, one of the first pictures that was posted was again of Kiran Majumdar and the new person who's heading Infosys, and everyone else having lunch with him. So I think this entire notion of who decides how the city develops again, it's like that song, Dunu. I don't know if you remember, from Fiddler on the Roof, If I Were a Rich Man, where he says, that, I'd sit there and people will come to me and they will ask me for answers of everything under the sun, because when you're rich, they think you really know. So that's precisely how it is. I mean, I'm just, saying it as a joke, but it's so frustrating and angering that that's exactly how it takes place. So I think, that's something that we also need to bear in mind. The third point I wanted to make was a comment was made, that this is a right question at a wrong time. I don't think there's ever a right time. I mean, I think, this battle against capital is something that has been going on for long, and it's something that is going to continue for longer. Of course, at this point in time, one can think, okay, perhaps trade unions are not as strong as they used to be. Perhaps the working class unity is not how it should be. Perhaps the way in which the crisis of capital is such that it makes it far more dangerous than before. It could be any of this, but I think this is an extremely important idea, and it's always a good time for a good idea, and that's what I believe, and that's what I'd like to believe, because we have this entire thing of working towards change. That is something that we can't put on a standby, and there's never a good time to threaten capitalists. I mean, I don't think we're ever going to find that time. So I think that I will be wary of remarks like that. The fourth point I wanted to make was this. I actually went through all the material that you all circulated. Thank you, and I really I congratulate all friends who have put in so much of effort to look at what the UN had to say, what the ICSR had to say, what various other governments in terms of laws that they've passed. Uh, but one thing that I thought could be added to this is a kind of a understanding from within our own constitutional frame. So, for instance, you have the directive principles of state policy, Article 39A, Article 41, 43, 43A, which to some extent gives us some idea of the kind of, at least whether it's on paper, there's no doubt about it. But I think even, for instance, when Comrade Amarjeet was talking about living wages, the fact that Article 43 actually talks about minimum wages is something that we always keep going back to. So I think even in terms of this right to work, now this is the curious part when we look at it within the legal jurisprudence of our own country. There is no right to work as a fundamental right, but there's a right to protection of your employment, of your livelihood. Now, which is very bizarre, So there is no claim that you can make on the state that, you give me work outside of NREGA. There is no claim you can make, especially from a urban point of view. But of course, you can say that if I have work, then you cannot, violate my right to work. So I think this dichotomy is something that we need to engage in a little more, at least I'm talking purely from a constitutional law, purely within the four corners of the law kind of a approach. I think that is something that would help us. Last 2 points, I won't be taking too much more time. The Now, like I said in the beginning, when we talk about the right to work, for me, it's intrinsically linked to right to the city. Right to the city does not mean shelter. I mean, I think it always collapses into this, that the working class, the poor, oh, bechare, unko ek ghar de do, build a house on, an apartment, throw them into that, and that does it. I think right to the city is a far more deeper kind of a notion. I don't have time to get into it. There's enough written about it, but I would just request that you also bear this in mind. And when we talk of right to work, I would say that we need to also bear one more thing, and perhaps a few other thoughts in so far as that is concerned. One is, what is our imagination of this right to work? What is it intended to do? Friends have spoken about it should, living wage, whether it should be on demand or available at any given point in time. I would say, we can look at it from in three tropes. One is, it's a guaranteed employment, whether by demand or otherwise. Secondly, the notion of living wages is part and parcel of it. And in any way, since we're asking for things, we're saying that we're trying to build some kind of imagination, I think let us also be a little bit expansive. The other thing is, it should also ensure take care of the working conditions. And I would say, add another point to it, that it should also introduce certain protections for the kind of unprotected informal work that already exists in the cities, whether it's informal, casualized, casual, whatever we want to call it. But this right to work would also need to necessarily have protections for them. I don't think there's any gain saying that laws that exist do not work. We are talking about or that is not being implemented. That's, of course, that's a given. But here I think that we're thinking a little expansively, so that's something that we can do. The last point is that I think that we should also be extremely conscious of two things. One is the kind of structural kind of oppressions, the structures that exist within society, which regulate access to employment, which regulate wages. Gender is something that all friends have spoken about. I think there are two other aspects here. One is, if you were to look at the Rajinder Sachar report, which I think is perhaps the only report that sheds light on the absolutely dismal realities of the Muslim community in urban areas. I think when there this, and again, drawing from some of the legislations that especially countries in Europe have, where they protect minorities, especially insofar as their employment is concerned. I think the time has come for us to actually make this a political demand. The second part in that, of course, is the notion of caste-based occupations. The fact that your sanitation workers will be Dalit, the fact that your sweepers will be Dalit, the toilet cleaners will be Dalit, the domestic workers cleaning toilets will be Dalit, the housekeeping staff cleaning toilets in hospitals, malls, anywhere will be Dalit. I think it's inescapable. So how does one address something of that nature? I think is also a question that we'll have to contest with. And the last point, everyone has spoken about the gender questions. I really don't have nothing more to add on that, but except one thing. Very interestingly, the Supreme Court in a recent judgment spoke about the value of housework and how that it's unpaid work. Now, I would say that this is something that we should actually take extremely seriously when we are talking about this entire notion of right to work. So these were some few thoughts. There are, of course, certain proposals that are already there, and I think if we can get into it at some other point. For instance, Jordres recently came up with a proposal of his called the decentralized urban employment and training, which I think is interesting. I mean, one may not agree with it fully, but it gives us some kind of a thing. I think even Amit Bonsole also came up with something. Him and Rajendra Narayanan, they also had written something about this. So I think there is some amount of thinking that's also happening in other circles. Let's just see, I think, how one can have a decent engagement on across all these ideas. So thanks, Dunu. This is what I wanted to share.
Thanks, Clifton. I'm glad that you've been thinking about these issues, and so many other facets are being opened up. We need to take this debate much further, obviously, but today's webinar is essentially to place these issues on the canvas so that later on we can develop them further. Comrade Mariam Dhawale, are you there? There you are. So can I now request you to address the issues that have already come up as well as some of your own views?
Yeah.
Comrade Mariam is with the All India Democratic Women's Association, and the association has been again very active on women's issues in the last many years, and taking up not just the issue of work but all forms of oppression. So it would be interesting to hear from you what thoughts you may have on this subject. Over to you.
Thank you, Dunuji, and hello to everybody present here. I think it's an extremely important initiative that has been taken by INHAF, and sort of encouraged a discussion on this point. Primarily because even in AIDWA at present, for a long time, we are, especially in the background of the pandemic, we have been continuously brainstorming on this whole issue of employment per se, and especially in the urban areas. Because as rightly pointed out over here, that to some extent, I mean, it's not really a very great big relief, but to some extent in the rural areas, because of the Manrega, we call it Manrega, not NREGA, it's MNREGA. So the Manrega, where some amount of work was available, though of course it has been a constant struggle to get that work, but something is there. It is like something better than nothing kind of, though it's not really what you call helping people to lead their lives in a dignified manner, but something is there. But in the rural urban areas, there is absolutely nothing. And today, the urban employment is at an extremely critical stage. Now, in the women's organization, the first and most primary thing that comes up every time, anywhere you go, is some amount of work is needed. Now, I also went through all the documents that were circulated. Very interesting information is also there in it. And yes, congratulations to all who have taken a lot of trouble to prepare it. It will be very useful. But when we are taking this discussion, I think, it has to be at different levels, because when you are saying right to employment, right to work is not looked upon as a right in a way. So when you say, if you have a government in power, or if you have a system where employment is looked upon as a right, then the policy and the implementation of it works in a totally different manner. So here we have a system that doesn't look at as employment as a right. So in such a system, when we are proposing certain things, we feel through experience, it has to be looked upon at various levels. It cannot be a totally uniform kind of a right to employment. Now, in the urban areas, we know a lot. There are two kinds. One is, of course, the whole organized sector and all that. But a very, very large section in the cities is totally dependent on the entire unorganized informal labor, right from the milkman at your doorstep to the domestic worker, to the sanitation worker, to the water department worker, to the transport worker. I mean, it's the whole city functions on their labor. Now, we have taken up this issue very, very strongly in Maharashtra especially. We have seen that this labor that comes into the city there is absolutely no documentation of it. Nobody knows. In fact, when this lockdown was declared and the migrant labor just sprouted all over the country, there was a scene from the cities. Everybody was, like looking at it amazed. Ye kya ho raha hai types, I mean, they just mushroomed from everywhere. And now at least construction workers and domestic workers to some extent, and maybe some others, are being, sort of documented. But per se, migrant labor is not recognized. His existence, he doesn't exist. He or she doesn't exist. So first and most primary thing would be registration of any migrant worker or any worker who comes in the informal sector in the cities. Secondly, after that, there's the different kinds of works. Now, when these different kinds of works are there, who is going to be accountable? There are certain who are working as contract labor in say transport section or the water department section, electricity section, that could be government administration. But what about those who are not really in government section, who are actually catering to the population at large? So how does one work that out? But accountability has to be fixed. That it cannot be unaccountable, किसी की मर्जी से नहीं चलना चाहिए. So that is second part. Third part, when you say employment guarantee, the employment guarantee scheme has to work at different levels. One, as I said, that overarching policy of giving employment, that one thing. But secondly, in a urban area, when now domestic workers were given no work, I mean, they didn't have work. Even now, so many of them are not being called back in the apartments to work. How will they live? So there has to be some initiative taken. But this can only happen, no, actually, unfortunately, we have a government who is totally insensitive. So it doesn't really work. But in certain areas where the movement is there, we took that up. And initiative, we made community kitchens, collected some materials, and saw to it that people who were starving were supplied food. Now, actually, if the government does that, then the people get work and starving families get food. So it's an inclusive kind of a thing, but that needs a very proper planning. So that kind of linkages. Third, we've also took up the issue of self-help groups. Now, there are a lot of self-help groups. In certain areas, we demanded that the government offices, they need certain materials. For example, they need files. Self-help groups should be trained to produce those files, and the government should take a guarantee, like the tehsil office or whatever should take the guarantee of buying those files. And so they get a proper market, not market, but there is some system by which they can earn. Now, all these factors need to be looked into when preparing this government employment scheme. Secondly, the whole issue of, yes, it was raised here, housing, minimum wage, that has to be, because who will decide on, I mean, that calculation has to be there. Even for domestic workers in the union, we have been continuously asking, demanding that there has to be some kind of a minimum standard applied. Otherwise, wo malak ke marji se, they decide the payment. It should not be like that. Minimum standard. But so according calculations have to be there for these things. The education of the children, the housing, the food. Now the government is saying that they're going to start with the ration cards can be used anywhere in the country for anybody. Now this government doesn't think through, now it just declares something, but which and how anybody can go and avail, because that shop should have that kind of grain to give. So I mean, it's not really thought out at all, and it's going to be a further mess. But anyway, that part. Then the pensions, the compensations, the illness benefits. So these kind, and along with that, skill development. You see, most of them are from very poor sections, and they just come here to sell their labor. So even to train them to go ahead in their own lives, certain skill development, I'm talking basically keeping women in mind actually. So skill development proposals whereby they can progress further, that is one part also. And then the whole issue of health. You see, this whole exploitative system is gone to such, I mean, the crisis has reached to such extent that today I can give two examples. Surely, one is the sugarcane cutters in Maharashtra, and the second is the garment workers in Tamil Nadu. Both these places, instances have appeared of women taking out their wombs, undergoing hysterectomy, so that they do not have to take leave during their menses periods. And they're so afraid of losing their work or jobs that their physical situations are also challenged. So these all aspects need, and of course the question of safety of women, the night work which is now being introduced in many places, all these need to be looked into when talking of urban employment guarantee scheme. But yes, we must develop it and must take it forward for discussions within the community also, because from there also you will get many ideas within the in the bastis, in the mohallas, even in the villages, because they come to the cities, so they know what problems they are facing. But it needs to be reiterated again and again, and at some point of time the government will have to be forced to bring about some kind of a legislation whereby you demand work as a right at in the rural areas to some extent. And one last thing I would like to say, that women's work has to be recognized as a separate work, because like in Manrega we have seen, in many of the works that are done, the women's work is not recognized as a separate work. She is a companion to the man who is working, and her wage is not separately calculated. It's the man's wage that is calculated, her labor becoming a free labor, and it's like a teamwork. So she actually, in effect, especially in that work of lifting mud, when they have to dig that hole, that lake, she is the one who carries the mud and throws it. But that work is not calculated separately, it is calculated in the digging work which the man does. Similarly, in the urban areas, because there is this tendency, whenever there is this urban guarantee schemes, that in those schemes certain labors are called upon only as teams. They are called as teams. In Manrega also it's like that. Some of the works they are called as teams, and team meaning the woman comes as free labor. So this we have to look into, and thank you, Dunuji, for giving us the opportunity to place our thoughts through our experience. I'm not in a trade union, so I wouldn't speak as a trade unionist. I'm basically a activist of the women's organization, and I have placed my thoughts on the basis of the struggles that we take and the experiences that we have. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing these different dimensions uh, into the whole notion of right to work, and particularly of how women are situated in this. And you're right, we need to take this discussion much further. I will now call upon Jammu Anand from Nagpur, who's been working with different small unions in the city. And Jammu, you have been hearing and listening very silently to what has been going on. I'm sure you will, with your experience, be able to add further to the dialogue. Over to you. Jammu, you're on mute.
जम्मू म्यूटेड हो, पहले अनम्यूट करो.
Unmute karo
No,
ya to.
he's not unmuted. His audio is
His,
not connected. We
his
cannot hear
audio
you,
is
sir.
not connected. You're not wired.
Maybe you can try without your headphones.
Headphone हटा के
अंकिशा की
देखिए.
साइड से हो ना, अंकिशा की साइड से लग रहा है.
हाँ, now we can hear you. हाँ, अब बोलो.
Okay, so I would like to congratulate you, Dunu, because you was chasing this issue of urban right to work since many years. Many a time you were getting irritated also because whatever your expectations from various squatters were not, responding the way you wanted. But today I'm very happy to see various trade union leaders, national office bearers are very much in this webinar. I must congratulate you. And I am also very happy to be in this panel. I don't know why you kept me, but this gives me an opportunity to listen Amarjeet Kaur and to see him on video, with whom I worked many years before. I don't know whether she remembers me now. And of course, the Mariam, we both worked. I was in AISF and she was in SFI in Maharashtra. So I'm feeling very happy and energetic to be in this panel. Yes, for last many years, I'm working on various issues, not only in trade union, but the issues which are concerned to urbanization. And when Dunu was trying to introduce this issue, activists like me was very much uncomfortable because the whole idea of right to work in urban, how it, how to conceive this and how it will work and how the work as a right in urban on the lines of Manrega can really be executed. But coming on that, before, what I feel is we will have to look into this issue, taking the cities as urban. See, a sea change is coming in urbanization. And today the urban centers are no more treated as center of living. It is being treated as centers of investment. And that fundamental change that has taken place since the days of JNN URM in 2005, where first time the government, through their documents, have redefined the cities. So when the cities are redefined and now being cities are treated or looked into as centers of investment, in that context, I want to see the whole issue of right work as a right, because if the investment is there, how it translates in providing the work. Before that, what is actually happening in urban as far as work is concerned? Urban till yesterday was the biggest center of providing formal dedicated employment, where the state was the model employer, where the state was providing employment, guaranteeing the social security with the aim to uplift the living standard of those who are being incorporated in urban, informal economy, formal employment. That is what is now declining. Dedicated employment is declining in urban centers. The model employer is volunteered to shrink itself. there is a complete ban on recruitment. These are the things which are happening. On the other side, the informal economy is thriving in the urban center. Informal labor is the order of the day. The working, the urban centers are no more now providing a good number of employment, but they have opened up where different types of livelihood can flourish. So the urban centers are now become the centers of creating livelihoods, and these livelihoods comes with all sort of insecurity. Employment insecurity, there is no social security, even there is no guarantee of place where the informal economy or informal labor does his livelihood. There is always a threat in the urban cities at a time when urban space, both vertical and horizontally, appropriated by the big capital. So in that context, how we look the cities where the employment should become a right. My understanding about this issue says that the quantum of investment today a urban center is inviting, attracting, is that investment really translating into providing decent work? Is that investment is translating in providing employment which finally results in raising the standard of living? So my experience shows where when the cities are investing, attracting huge investment, and where the huge wealth is being produced, it is not corresponding in generating employment. Therefore, what I feel is, can we think on the lines where investment and ratio of creation of employment be worked out? Because there is no meaning today in cities where other incidental expenses like electricity tariff, water tariff, rent, property tax, everything has been increased and is being increasing every year, because all these services at one time being provided by the public body. It may be a public state body or it may be a local body. Now all these services have been privatized. As a result, these services have become dearer. And in comparison to that, the employment scenario is such where people at large, the working people at large, lost their employment and took shelter in livelihood, which doesn't help them to even maintain their life while covering these expenses. Therefore, I believe that if the cities, because we have to look the urban centers in the perspective of post-JNNURM. Therefore, my suggestion is how we would like to translate where we can compel the state which can come out with clear-cut understanding about employment that should be decent employment, be generated, that should be permanent type of employment be generated, because investment is coming in very much in parallel nature of work, and state is now outsourcing its own work, where today the model employer, who should be their model employer, is now turned to be most violator of the various statutory labor laws. Today, all the government offices, if you look into, the contractual workers have overpowered the regular workers, and the gap of the wages which the contractual worker is getting and a permanent staff, today they are getting 7 pay commission. So 1/4 of the permanent staff salary is the wage of contractual worker who is working in the government department with the counterpart. So in that situation, the right to employment is a very big question, where the governments are now with the capital. How this whole analogy of right to work can really trigger to organize the urban youth and the working people is a big challenge. At the end, I would like to get the ideas, because this whole right to work looks very romantic, no doubt. In a country where unemployment is so high, where poverty is so high, where disparity is so high, employment is the only savior. So how to translate in urban, where the employers are heterogeneous, where the employers are state as well as private. So in that context, how we can ask or make the state responsible, like in case of Manarega, because in Manarega, the whole village where the employers are very few, and biggest employment is either irrigation or the agriculture. But in urban, it is entirely a different situation. But we can very much think on the lines, being the urban centers are being transformed into centers of investment. So this investment should translate into producing decent employment. So here I think I should stop.
Thank you, Jammu, for your ideas as well as questions about how investment in cities can be translated into livelihoods and work that is secure. That's a very important question, and we obviously need to take it up. All the issues that different panelists have raised actually need a much larger discussion, and we have already got to our time limit. So I think we can have just one other round. There are some questions in the chat box and in the Q&A, which you can all have a look at as you are on your computers. Before I call Shweta to speak, I just want to offer you two ideas on which we could, just two, I mean, there are many more, but two ideas on which we could possibly carry this conversation further. The first is to do with the wage. What is the minimum, the living, or the floor level, and other forms of wage? And if you all, you're I'm sure all aware of it, that wage is actually dependent on food intake. That is, the worker should be able to get enough food in order to be able to work. That is the principle, basic principle of wage. And in Indian jurisprudence, that has been included, that has been enlarged to include not just the worker, but the worker's family also. So you're talking about a family of four with the basic elements of roti, kapda, makan, which is the 1957 resolution. So food, shelter, and clothing is included. And then the Supreme Court, of course, added elements of fuel, of lighting, of electricity, water, education, health, pensions, medical insurance, everything has been included into living wage. But primarily it is based on the measurement of energy output of the worker. This energy output of the worker has been a monopoly of institutions, laboratories, and so on, and the workers have never had access to it. The cheapest instrument currently for doing this work costs about 23 lakhs. But in the last 3 years, we have been able to develop a smaller instrument which costs about 80,000. So we're now in a position to offer this to unions everywhere, to be able to measure, even for housework, how much energy goes into this work, and therefore on a so-called scientific basis, what is the wage that can be demanded for that work. This is one thought that I leave with you. The second thought, which is has slightly larger implications, various speakers have spoken about the Dalits and their relationship to sanitation work, dirty work, and so on. On that, some work that we have done shows that actually excreta uh, it disintegrates much faster in the open, in the presence of air and sunlight. So the very process of putting it down into a sewer is actually going against the natural process of decomposition. And when it is put into the sewer, it actually replicates the intestine. So all kinds of gases are produced in the sewer and in the septic tank, which is what workers die of. So actually the answer is a technical intervention to, to redesign waste treatment and disposal in presence of air and oxygen. That means it actually has to be in the open. So how do you design a excreta management system which is not underground, but which is overground? And as a matter of fact, the moment you design such a system, you get rid of all the poisonous gases. Workers will not die. Workers will not have to go down into sewers and into septic tanks and be exposed. It deals with a whole range of occupational health issues. And in addition, the work starts getting dignified because it's done in the open, and people who are, and if you decentralize it, people who are producing the excreta can no longer get away from their responsibility of having disposed of the excreta merely by flushing the chain. So in a sense, you begin to redesign the city if you start looking at ways in which this essential work can be done. And we need more and more research to go into these kinds of work and how they can be made safer, how they can be made more productive. We are doing some work with the ancillary chain of industries in Manesar, which is all automobile industry, looking at how productivity is measured. And I'm sure none of you have much clue about productivity is measured, except it's measured in terms of capital. How do you measure productivity from the perspective of the worker is a challenge that comes up, because the moment you start investigating workers' productivity from workers' point of view, then you start opening up the whole economic analysis of work and investment. So I'm just offering these ideas as something that we need to look at even when we think of redesigning the city, as well as of the right to work with all the other connotations of work, which is shelter, services, health, education, all the other issues that we've been talking about, and how to draw workers into these research activities, which is very eminently possible. If workers can run factories, they can do research of this kind. With those inputs, I will now turn to Shweta, and after that, we will quickly go back along the line to take all your views in case you have time, please do look at the chats and the Q&A. And if you want to incorporate that into your suggestions, that will be very good. Kirti, I think we have enough time for doing this dialogue. So I assume Kirti has said yes because he is mute. So we will move on to the next phase. Shweta, can I have your
Yeah,
views, please?
yeah.
Shweta works in Bombay amongst the slums and some very fascinating work that has been done there. So over to you, Shweta.
Yeah. Thank you, Dunu, for your perseverance on this particular question. And after the August panel has kind of put together so many different facets to it, I find it extremely difficult to put forward my suggestions, but here are a few of the things that I think could probably add to the discussion that has already happened. So, I mean, I may be repetitive because everybody has spoken, but looking at urban, so looking at the first question, whether can the workers plan the city? Workers do plan the city. Workers do plan the city in many ways, not just by their services, but the fact by the sheer presence in a particular location that they are. Now let's take an example of the domestic worker. The domestic worker prefers to stay in a slum which is close to her workplace, and she prefers to walk to the workplace, does not want to spend time on travel, so that she can optimize her potential of work and can earn maximum. This is definitely related to her question of wages, because it's exploitative. She needs to work more households, and that is why. So by default, what I'm trying to say is the sheer presence of slums at particular location in itself is an indication of the fact that workers do plan their city informally, and it is never acknowledged. These slums are looked at as parts of the city which can be evicted, displaced, and thrown to the peripheries of the cities, where their hardships further increase. And then there is a question of their right to work. And that particularly, I mean, women by default lose all their work, because for them it's very difficult to travel to their original locations of work. And the drudgery of living in the periphery of the city also adds on to the care work burden of it. The other thing that I want to highlight here is the kind of development that we are looking at, that the kind of development that we have looked at for people is also not something, I'm talking purely from the point of view of their housing, is something that's so unsustainable, and it does not allow them to live in the spaces that they occupy. Firstly, they started occupying those places because it allowed them to work. Now, with the kind of development that is planned, they are being thrown out of their spaces, that by default, they are being thrown out of their work also. And this we have seen specifically in Mumbai. Let's, for example, look at the South Mumbai, where if there is a slum redevelopment that has happened, because it is a tradable commodity now, people have opted to exchange it for monetary benefits and move to the periphery of the city, but have continued to come to work as domestic help to South Mumbai, because their services are not required so much so in the places that they are rehabilitated or they have chosen to go. So we have to very carefully engage with the fact that the spaces that they occupy in the city continue to remain with them. Also, along with that, we also have to figure out ways of improving their living conditions. And the kind of planning that we are doing definitely does not allow that affordability and sustainability in their favor. It does not go in their favor. They are by default displaced from it. Now the question of So they do plan the cities. We don't acknowledge them. And the people in position and power, as Clifton was saying, who plan the city, only few percentage, not even 10%. The last development plan of Mumbai could implement only 7% of what was planned in the development plan. So obviously this has not worked. So why not have an engagement with the workers, with the people who are residents of the city, who are making the city tick, to make a more inclusive plan, which they already do. So that is something that I wanted to bring to the forum. The second, about the jobs. Now, as we have to look at this entire jobs situation, job creation, wages, livelihood, in the context of COVID, demonetization, and then COVID, and then what has happened. So in the urban areas, the job losses have been more than the rural areas. Now the shift in the urban areas have been from formal to informal, from formal to self-employed, and from informal to daily wage or casual or self-employed. Now, looking at this kind of a matrix, if we are envisaging an employment guarantee, then what kind of employment guarantee are we looking at? If people are already engaging, if the work is exploitative in nature, if the work that they are doing is done at a particular location which does not conform to the norms that is ideal for working condition, then it is our responsibility. If people have created jobs, then it is the government's responsibility to acknowledge the presence and to look into these self-employed people and how things can be regulated for them. For them, they need finances, they need skill upgradation. Comrade Mariam Dhawale spoke about skill upgradation. They need finances, they need upgradation. They probably also need some kind of tools and equipments to better mechanization to better their productivity. If they are ensured better productivity, they will in turn share their profits with the workers that they have. But again, since this does not happen, there is another layer of exploitation that exists. And for that, we have to ensure that there are legal provisions of what can be the minimum wage. A lot of women, for that matter, work from the confines of their homes. Now, when the home-based work is done, definitely a lot of self-employed also work from the spaces in their homes, and especially in informal sector, in the kind of workers that we are talking of, if their habitat is unsafe and is threatened and is envisaged in a fashion which does not allow spaces, then spaces for work, then this entire exercise becomes futile of thinking about income generation or livelihoods. So the question of livelihoods is very, very, very closely connected to their habitats, and especially post-COVID, when a lot of people are getting into home-based employments, are getting into self-employment, then their habitats particularly needs to be protected. And the kind of development and redevelopment that we see does not allow this kind of protection. So can we think about 2-3 kind of proposals, especially in context to housing? Just thinking out of the box is one. If there is a redevelopment, Dunu was telling me that Delhi mein ek slogan hai, jahan jhuggi wahi ghar. If this is the slogan that Delhi is talking about, then we should capitalize on it. But Delhi, jahan jhuggi wahi ghar, lekin wahan pe 20 manzile ki imarat, तो वो 20 मंजिले की इमारत will not be sustainable for the people जिनके लिए वो बनाया गया है. So then in that case, and what is the biggest problem that, apart from the quality of life, apart from the fact that becomes vertical, accommodations also become a part of this development, and the rental is subsidizing the maintenance of the people who are owners. So can we think of some mixed development of this kind? Whenever these spaces
I think we've lost you. Shweta?
Her audio is muted.
She is muted or she's lost
I
connectivity.
guess that is because of
am
the
I
connectivity.
audible?
Yeah.
We have lost your connectivity. No, your network connection is bad. Maybe if you just switched off your video.
Yeah, you can go ahead now.
No, it's not working. So, given the lack of time, can I, maybe Shweta can put her comments in the chat box also, but can I now ask the remaining panelists to spend about 2-3 minutes each to basically focus on all the issues that have been raised and how they would like to take it further. Obviously, it is not possible to conclude a discussion, particularly on network, on the net in this fashion, but we have to eventually meet physically and take this discussion further. But if you can therefore uh, define the
I'm
issues.
happy to not speak at all.
Okay, so can I then, no, it's all right. Just asking everybody if they can take 2-3 minutes each to actually suggest how this can be taken further. Because dependent on that, then we can organize a series of workshops, meetings, and activities, hopefully. So I will go in the reverse order. Jammu, you have 3 minutes. Unless,
yeah. Hello.
Huh.
I think on these suggestions, if some concrete issues comes up, on that we can develop an understanding, and a workable program can be created out of it, which will be both in form of demand generating and in the form of reaching out to the people who are badly either in informal sector or who are badly confronting the problem of unemployment in urban cities.
Okay, thank you. That was brief and I think that puts things into place. Comrade Mariam?
Dunu,
Sorry, Kannan.
Dunu, can I sign off because I have to?
Okay.
But I will take half a minute.
Okay. Since you have to sign off.
With all your permission and understanding, I think it has been a very interesting discussion. But my feeling is that I'm like many of you, I have been in this kind of discussions and deliberations since the early 1980s, if not before. And maybe it was mid 70s, actually, we started some of these discussions. There are many organizations who are now working and also articulating these issues. So I think there need to be a talk across the board of similar thinking organizations and groups and come to some kind of a common framework. Having said that, I don't think we can also take up a large number of issues at the same time, although we may have a certain articulation of all the issues. So I would rather also prefer if this group could concentrate on a few priority areas And that would be, I think, the right to work, the right for a minimum wage and housing. I have something to share on housing, but I will do that at a later time, especially on the migrant workers. And the organization I am associated with, we have now set up a dormitory. It's only a beginning for Shweta knows about it because the Working People Charter is in touch with me. This is a dormitory center for migrant workers. About 620 of them can stay at a time, and on a payment of 1,000 rupees per month, which is being paid by their employers, because the employers find it easier to get them together in one place and also arrange for their transportation, etc. So this is an initiative by the state, and we only did the building part of it. So it all depends on politics, and unfortunately the politics today is not at all pro-labor, to put it very mildly. So I don't know because the earlier 70s and 80s strategy will not work, you know. So we need to rethink our whole strategy and also get more people to subscribe to the idea of an inclusive development, because mere growth doesn't really deliver, and growth is in a crisis and globalization is in a crisis. But the options for that is being worked out in a very nationalistic, xenophobic nationalism. So we need to bring in some of the realistic things and go forward. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Kannan.
Yeah.
Yeah, Comrade Mariam, yes.
Yeah, just 1 minute. It's one is yes. It was a very fruitful discussion, and yeah, I'm happy to see you also, Jammu. We have been fighting the police on the roads together during the student movement, so it was a pleasure to see you speak here. And there are just one thing, you see, what we need to do is, I feel maybe a draft can be prepared on the basis of these discussions, circulated. So every organization also gives its own inputs, discusses within themselves also to strengthen it. And all these factors, because we know the government, the administration, we know their nature. So keeping all that in mind, and many important suggestions have also come in the chat box. Also, I was reading, Comrade Dinesh Abrol has talked about, can we experiment with formation of cooperatives so that some kind of employment generation. So like that way, many things can come up. So it could be very diversified, very decentralized kind of thing also. That is one. So secondly, there was a question over there regarding self-help groups. I won't go into great detail, where somebody has asked that it is in a way exploited. Self-help groups are also exploited. So shouldn't we ask for their dissolution? No, we cannot ask for their dissolution, because self-help groups have given the opportunity to women for coming out of their homes. And it has created a sense of identity for women. We have seen in the rural areas, it has helped women to have an identity of themselves. Yes, it is exploitative because they are running government schemes where they are not being paid, where they are where their entire savings are wiped out. All these factors are there, but it cannot be. We should never ask for its dissolution. Instead, the government has to take proactive steps to help them and strengthen them, not exploit them. So that's it. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Clifton?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, really,
Yeah.
I don't have much to add. Just I think that since this is an endeavor to try and to imagine something new, I feel that we really should not be too restricted. And my belief is that we cannot look at right to work isolated in isolation, as it were. So especially in this urban context, I'd like to just reiterate that the one thing, of course, is that this thing of improving standards of living. I think that is something that needs to underpin every kind of approach that we take in so far as this is concerned. There are several comments several questions / comments that are made, which I think if you're going to get into it'll take some time. But one very interesting point which was made was about the entire changing composition of the working class in urban India. For instance, gig workers. And I think that's again just one section of the working class that we're talking about. So with each of these sections of the working class come a very separate set of challenges, as it were. So imagining a one size fits all kind of a right to work imagination would require very, very deep engagement. And the other point, of course, is also the forces that one actually has to take on in the in urban areas. The reason why one of the other reasons why I link it up to right to city is, for instance, these feudal lords in urban areas who go by the name of resident welfare associations. Basically, I mean, determining. We've seen what's happened recently in Delhi, where which is that area, not Munirka, where the Raj Center had to come up.
What?
In Delhi, where the Haj Center had to come up, the Resident Welfare Association.
Dwarka.
Dwarka.
Yeah. So Dwarka, you have a resident welfare, the Haj Center. You have a resident welfare associations coming together and saying we'll not allow Muslims into this kind of areas. So which is why I think we really need to look at that. And the last point is you spoke about. I'm just reiterating this: the gender question, the caste question, and the Muslim question in employment. I mean, if again, I'm just saying this again, and I hope people will go to this Rajendra Sachar report and read the manner in which Muslims have been thrown out of any kind of organized employment. They are not there in the organized sector. They're not in government employment. They're definitely not in politics, and they're primarily in self-employed informal sectors. So I would say that these aspects are something that we can probably touch upon. Sorry, I'm sounding like a stuck record, but these are just too dear to my heart. I don't think that we can ignore these. Thanks.
No, it's important to have this passion in the discussion. Otherwise, we are not going to get very far. Can I now ask Kavita?
Yeah.
Kavita, it's yours.
Yeah, hi. I think rather than adding anything, I think, my thoughts are where can we, I do in fact think that maybe an in-person meeting at some point will be possible, maybe, a little later, and that would be fruitful, because if we could think about involving trade unions and involving people's organizations and actually be able to hold some kind of convention or something around this, say sometime next year, early next year or something, when the COVID situation, let us hope, will improve and allow for all this, then I think that would be actually, the way to go. So if we could continue discussing towards that, then, and we could do it in different places also. If we don't want to have a large number of people in one spot, if we want smaller gatherings, then we could have it at various zones or even various cities separately. But we could take it forward like that, so have it in more than one, have it in, say, 7-8 spots, something like that, where we actually discuss take this, if we could develop some kind of outline and take it, further for discussion, open it up more for discussion, make it more something that, can attract, can be opened up for discussion among unemployed young people, working class, etc., etc. I think that would be really the way forward.
Oh, great, excellent. So at least there is some ideas coming about continuing this process, which is very welcome. Gautam?
Yeah. Sometimes it's at some point in the discussion, I think it's very important to be dispassionate about things, so that we actually move forward and don't get stuck in what might be differences. One of the biggest weaknesses of Indian labor law has been the fact that it has catered to too many special cases. I think there is a need to come up with a universal minimum for everything: working standards, employment standards, wage standards, etc., 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 safety standards, etc., etc. I think that's good, must be part of our fight back against the codes. And I don't think anything over here can happen. We'll be talking in the skies if we didn't talk about the regime we're faced with. I think the second thing is, yes, we can keep talking about the ravages of capitalism. Those are before us. It, as was famously said, it's the most dynamic mode of production. We have to fight it. We can't keep saying, oh, they do this, oh, they do that. Yeah, we just have to fight it. We have to fight it day in and day out. And I say this with some pride, that's what trade unions do. But really, I think one question says, can you set out an agenda of an urban right to work? I think I tried to say it when I spoke. I'm going to repeat it very briefly. 2 parts. One, which provides employment, which includes the private sector, where the private sector receives some kind of subsidy. The subsidy needs to be discussed. I will add to that, we have failed models of wage subsidies in South Africa and other places. We need to learn from those rather than say, oh, it failed in South Africa, so we can't work it. And the second part of it is whatever public work is possible, maintenance of roads, etc., where we actually look at the cooperative model, but we look at the cooperative model very much part of social, at the center of social reproduction. And I will repeat, yes, there are multiple layers of discrimination, but in the history of capitalism, nothing is worse than the discrimination against women. Nothing is worse than the discrimination of a Dalit woman. Nothing is worse than the discrimination of a Muslim woman. Yeah. I won't take 2 minutes to actually think of what was, in a way, for me, the most inspiring contribution, and that was of Jammu Anand. He actually talked about, without saying so in as many words, the vast swath of self-employed in our urban areas. Why are they self-employed? They're self-employed because they don't have jobs. Do they make, their government says, oh, entrepreneurship. Are they entrepreneurs? They're not entrepreneurs. They're engaged in self-exploitation. They're not engaged in self-employment. They're actually engaged in self-exploitation. Ask a tea vendor on a road, are you willing to join the government of India as a sweeper? He'll give his right arm. If it was her, she would give both arms. Yeah. It's what they produce, goods and services, that must be socialized into a cooperative framework. That is, in fact, I mean, what the BJP wants to do is actually push all that production of goods and provision of services into the corporate sector. That's going to push up, that will push up the cost of living. The fact that the urban working class survives is that there's a large number of them involved in self-exploitation. That is the implicit subsidy and connect of the informal sector to the formal sector, where actually the formal sector, right from the very pinnacles of the highest technology of capital, actually bleeds this economy dry. And it is that which needs to be socialized. It is that which needs to be organized. It's not just about rebuilding our cities for people. It's also rebuilding our cities to lead a fight back. It's not just to, we have to when we say we reclaim our city, it has to be a class fight back. It has to be a fight back to reclaim the space of workers of the working class. And it must begin somewhere there.
Okay, thank you for stating some of the fundamentals, which are very important. Comrade Amarjeet, can we have your
yes, comrade. Good brainstorming, and naturally many people and various groups are working on various of the aspects of discussions which got raised today. This is also true that somewhere in future larger meeting and more groups could add into it, and there could be more of a common understanding to build narrative in India, what kind of cities we want and what should be the role of working masses in that, in building cities, in planning cities, in creating facilities, in earning their livelihood, and then happily having better places for living and rejuvenation, etc. So that will go ahead so that in future that activity can be taken up. Second thing, I agree with you that to begin with this continuity of this dialogue, somehow we focus one or two issues. And you suggested about wage issue. And I think this is going to be very, very important issue for working class in the country now. When the wage cut is a common thing and the government has constituted another committee, after their Satpati committee, now they have constituted another committee in which trade unions have no role to play. And through code on wages, the role of trade unions is going to be finished in deciding.
Comrade, we've lost you. Your voice is not coming anymore.
I guess there is a network issue.
What has happened? Her connection is gone?
Network,
She's on
yeah,
it.
she's there, but there's some network issue at her place.
Network
So
issue?
yeah, maybe that's why she disconnected.
Oh, okay. So just in case she returns, we can keep another slot for her. But that leaves you, Shweta. You get another 2 minutes to reflect on what all has been said.
So one, I would like to, one, we should take this conversation ahead. The focus can definitely be wages, and looking at how one can regulate the self-employed, and definitely looking at housing, because that's one of the areas which is of concern, and housing largely has become a space of occupation work. So looking at housing, wages, and regulation for the self-employed. Also the question, because all these are questions which overlap with the question of gender, class, religion. So one has to, address all of them without the one more thing that we have missed out in the conversation completely is there is a huge youth population which have not found employment at all. So so let's say there are graduates, so now 2 years of graduates who 2 batches of graduates who have not found employment at all. So youth is also one area to focus on. So yeah, so these are the things that we can take the conversation ahead with. You're on mute, Dunu.
No, thank you. I know. I am just trying to figure out what is the next concrete step. So I guess the first step would be to do a draft of all the suggestions that have come in, of all the issues that have been raised, and circulate that. And we will also try from our side to take up the discussion with working groups in Delhi, and so they can also reflect on it and see how a right to work conceptually can be framed to address all these issues. So perhaps in a week's time, we will be able to circulate it. And then after that, once you all have had a chance to go through it, discuss it with your colleagues and associations, then we can start thinking of smaller, maybe regional meetings, smaller group meetings, some person-to-person meetings to carry this forward. Thank you very much. I think it's been very elevating, at least for me, that this group has finally come together and shown a great interest in discussing this issue, which has been very dear to me for a very long time. But finally, it seems to be working out. So you can rest assured I'll follow it up, but I need your support. So now over to Kirti for his final comments, if he has any. If not, then we can wind up now. Kirti, I hope you don't have much to say.
Sir, you are on mute.
Kirti is on mute.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, Dunu, you have spoken so much, and you really want to take 2 minutes away from you from me. It's not very just. But let me kind of very quickly.
Okay, the clock is ticking. 2 minutes. Clock is ticking.
Okay. Don't worry. The two things very quickly. One is, of course, I must thank on behalf of INHAF for this very thoughtful, very insightful. And what is interesting about this whole conversation is based on so many years of work that people have done. And of course, there's so much of passion in what one is saying, so much deep conviction. And therefore, many thanks for this entire thing. I don't think it's enough for me to kind of thank across the board, say, look, the entire panel. Let me kind of, take half a minute and give names. So thanks, Kannan Saab. Thank Amarjeet ji. I heard you at the beginning of the pandemic somewhere, and I think it was wonderful to hear you again. Clifton bhai, very interesting, and Gautam Saab, insightful, and I want to kind of touch base with you again sometime to understand more. Jammu Saab, thank you very much for your views. Kavita ji, we lost you for first 20 minutes, but I'm very glad that you came back with a bang. And then thank you, Marina ji, and then of course Shweta. So thank you very much. I must thank my dear friend Dunu Roy for taking this up. He will tell you that I have been kind of pestering him for a very long time. This particular meeting has been planning for minimum 5 to 6 months, and I'm very delighted that it's finally happened. I must thank two of my colleagues, Rajesh, for a remarkably interesting and insightful introduction to the whole series of webinar we are doing. And of course, Ankisha, who has made this possible, works very hard behind the scenes. So thank you very much. I just wanted to kind of 1 more minute to say that this particular webinar is not in isolation. And Dunu knows this, that we essentially are planning not less than 5 or 6 webinars or meetings in order to take this further. Idea is this, that this idea is being talked about for a long time, whether you call it urban right to work, whether you call it urban employment guarantee scheme. This is being talked about for a long time. And we had one of the earlier webinar, which was on learning from Manrega. And an interesting observation was made in that meeting that suppose at this point of time, if urban employment guarantee scheme or urban right to work was in place, would the migrant workers and the worker suffer as much as they did? Now, there is no real answer, but it's a good question to ask. So what one is saying is this, that we've been talking about this for a very long time. It has been there in thoughts and concepts and ideas and notes. As a matter of fact, 3 or 4 states are doing this employment guarantee in one or the other form. And therefore, idea in this 5 or 6 webinars and the meeting that we're planning is to try and put this together on a platform and see. I'm not saying that one single design would emerge, but let us assess where we are and what kind of gap filling is required, what kind of additional work is required. So what I'm really telling you is this, that this is not one-off meeting. This is evidently one of the many more webinars and meetings that would happen. And of course, Dunu will be very much part of it, and all of you will be very much part of it. We would keep you informed. We would share how it is shaping, what design is taking. Even if it's naive, intention is to put everyone together, put ideas together, and see if we could take it somewhere in terms of not if the design approach to a design, if not, I think a way to design, whatever you want to say. But idea is to really kind of work and interact and talk in such a way so that we can take these ideas further. It's a very complex matter, as this particular meeting brought it out. But there is so much thought that has happened as well. So please be available as and when we call upon you. And what Dunu said, that I think follow-up work for this particular meeting, he talks about in a week, and is very glad that I think this particular webinar has brought the whole people together, the momentum together. So we look forward to what happens there as well. So thank you very much once again for your time, for your passionate presentation. So much learning that has happened. We're very grateful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you to you too.
Thank you, indeed.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you, Mody sir. Thank you. Amarjeet ji Singh.
Thank you, Kirti.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kirti, for being so uncharacteristically brief.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Amarjeet ji, are you there? Oh, you must have left.
I think she's left.